righty. Good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with our virtual program this evening. Hello, everyone in the chat. Thank you for sharing where you're from. Please continue to utilize that chat, introduce yourselves, say hello. We are very, very happy to have you all this evening. My name is Chloe Green. I serve as the Public Programs and Outreach Manager here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. And this evening, I am your host. Well, I am running the Zoom for this evening's program, our Lord Baltimore Fellow virtual lecture, Hampton, Resistance and Control on an Antebellum Maryland Plantation. This program is being recorded and will be made available for public viewing on our virtual program archive in the weeks following. This Zoom webinar is equipped with a Q&A chat function, so if you have questions or comments for our panelists, please use this Q&A chat and we will reserve time at the end of the program for your questions. But please feel free to utilize the chat throughout the program. Just make sure to check that setting on where the messages are going to as well. Sometimes it will switch between everyone in the chat or just hosts and panelists. So make sure to keep an eye on that, just if you want to interact with somebody else in the chat. So I will now kick off our program by introducing our moderator for the evening. Please give a warm welcome to Martina Cotto, who serves as the Vice President of Research and the France Merrick Director of the H. Furlong Baldwin Library. Welcome, Martina. Thank you so much for being here. I'm gonna leave it to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chloe, and thank you for introducing me too. That'll save us some time. It is my absolute pleasure to be here again tonight with another one of our Research Fellows public talks. This will be the last one in the series of our Research Fellows talks, but not the last program in our season. So if you're interested in watching those that preceded tonight's talk, we record our conversations and we post them in our digital archive online on our website. So please do check those out. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our fellow tonight. He has an interesting moment in his career to share. Until recently, Michael Guy was a doctoral candidate in the history department of George Washington University, where he studied race in early America with a focus on museums and historical sites as arbiters of historical memory. In March of this year, however, Michael successfully defended his dissertation titled How the Story is Told, an examination of narratives and history at Hampton. Congratulations, Michael. That's a big, big milestone. I'm so glad you're here. And your dissertation examined Hampton National Historical Site in Baltimore County, which is a plantation built at the end of the 18th century. And Michael used the stories told by docents at Hampton as windows of analysis into larger topics of race and slavery in Maryland. Michael also currently holds a predoctoral position with Johns Hopkins University's project called Black Beyond Data, where he works as part of the Black Press Research Collective. And through his research and work, Michael wishes to act as a bridge between public and academic history, which is kind of what we do at MCHC as well. So Michael has been our Lord Baltimore Research Fellow at the H. Furlong Baldwin Library since June 2024, and he's nearing, the last weeks or months of his fellowship. And Michael, before I hand the floor over to you, I just want to share with our audience that I really thought it was a good way to frame your talk the way you just did as we were preparing for this program, that the information that you will be sharing tonight comes from a chapter of your dissertation that contains some of the hardest and heaviest history, but also some of your best research. And I think it's a great opportunity to share, the resources, the prime resources that we have at our library, and what talented researchers like you can do with them. So thank you for being here. With that, I will give the floor over to you, and we'll see you at the end for the question and answer section.
Thank you for having me. Let me just share my screen. All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I want to thank the wonderful staff at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, not only for hosting this event, but also for being a great resource during my research. When we talk about Hampton, when we talk about slavery in the United States, our minds often go straight to the Deep South, cotton fields in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Georgia. But slavery was just as present and just as complicated in border states, especially right here in Maryland. Today, I want to tell the story of Hampton Plantation near Towson, Maryland. It was one of the largest plantations in the state, and a place where enslavement and control took on many forms, some benevolent and others more subtle. This isn't a story, this isn't just a story about brutality. It is a story about soft power, how slave owners maintained control without always lifting a whip. And it's also about resistance, the small and large ways the enslaved push back. We'll see how manipulation, reward systems, childhood conditioning, and even holiday traditions were used to keep people in line, and how those subjugated to that control found ways to reclaim power. Let's begin in 1829 with the death of Governor Charles Ridgely. At the height of governor, at the height of the gov, at the height under the governor, the Ridgely's holdings stood at over 24,000 acres and included multiple plantations, over 300 enslaved people. When Governor Charles Ridgely passed away in 1829, his son and heir, John Ridgely, inherited the estate of Hampton and its surrounding 3,000 acres, but not in a single enslaved laborer. Upon his deathbed, Governor Ridgely had granted immediate manumission for around a third of the enslaved people, while placing around another third in term enslavement. Those term slaves, along with those too old to be emancipated, would be split up amongst his heirs. John essentially inherited a plantation without enslaved labor. So what does John do? He rebuilds the institution of slavery at Hampton from scratch. But in a border state like Maryland, where freedom was just a few miles away, controlling enslaved people by brutality alone was risky, so John and his wife Eliza deployed something else: soft power. What do we mean by soft power in this context? It is the use of rewards, rituals, and paternalism to foster obedience and suppress dissident. Joseph S. Niles defines soft power as the brutality to get what you want through through attraction rather than coercion or payment. And we see this all over Hampton Estate and how the Ridgeleys ran their household, how they treated their enslaved, both the adults and children, and how they hosted parties. Take the stone slave quarters. Those weren't built for comfort or humanity. Eliza Ridgely wanted a plantation to resemble a European ornamental farm. For the enslaved of Hampton, those new stone slave quarters must have been looked upon with envy for all those who were not allowed to occupy one. Most slave quarters provided the barest of amenities, with few, if any, creature comforts. Josiah Henson described the slave quarters on the plantation he was enslaved as, quote, a log hut of a simple small room with no other floor than the trodden earth, in which 10 or a dozen persons, men, women, and children, might sleep, but which could not protect them from the dampness and the cold, nor permit the existence of the common decencies of life. There were neither beds nor furniture of any description, a blanket being the only addition to the dress of the day for protection from the chilliness of the air or the earth. Unquote. The stone slave quarters of Hampton must have been a nice change, especially in the cold winters of Baltimore County, dictating who was and was not assigned to one of the stone slave quarters. Eliza and John would be able to hold this privilege over the enslaved, ensuring hard work and good behavior. Eliza wished to tap into the femininity of European nobility, as she was fascinated with all things Europe. Replacing wooden shacks with stone structures wasn't about improving lives. It was about appearance. It was controlled by design. Or consider the annual Christmas parties. Every Christmas, the Ridgely family held a grand party. At one point during the evening, the music would stop, the doors would swing open, and a line of enslaved children would walk into the parlor. There waiting were Eliza and her daughter Eliza Diddy, while with a pile of gifts to hand out. Now here's a twist. Only the good children got presents. And what did good mean? Working sufficiently fast, not breaking anything, not speaking out of turn. Their criteria were vague, and that was the point. You never really knew what would get you a gift and what would leave you empty-handed. In 1842, young Eliza Wells, an enslaved girl of about 7, probably did not think the death of Eliza's Diddy's pet squirrel would leave her empty-handed that Christmas. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story of Eliza and her pet squirrel, but I'd like to retell that story with the concept of soft power in mind. On July 1st, 1842, while in her lessons, Charles Risley told his sister Diddy that their pet squirrel Bunny had died. Quoting her brother, Diddy wrote in her journal, quote, "Oh, do you know that our squirrel is dead? Hugh Brickhead's mother was at Hampton yesterday, and she says that he got out and one of the servants knocked him on the head and killed him," unquote. Later that day, Diddy asked her father about the death of her pet squirrel. Quote, "I asked him all about it, and he told me that little black Eliza, who cleans his cage, had knocked him on the head with a stick while he was playing about the room as usual, and that mother, a few days before, heard her say the nasty thing, some of these days I will wring the neck off it and fling it out of the window. And and she had called her and told her that if things happened to the squirrel, she would pay well for it. Father said he was going the next day to give her a good whooping for it," unquote. Little Black Eliza, as she was referred to by the Risley family, appears to be Eliza Wells, who may have been around 7 years old at the time of the events. Eliza Wells first appears in the Hampton records in a servant's clothing list around 1835. We can tell Eliza is a child as she appears on the Christmas list receiving a doll in 1841 and an Indian pipe in 1843. In 1842, Eliza Diddy, still upset over the death of Bunny the squirrel, wrote, "Not to receive any gift" next to young Eliza's name. If Eliza Wells was, in fact, responsible for the killing of Bunny the squirrel, her actions was just one of the many small ways an enslaved person could resist the institution of slavery. However, it is unclear if Eliza Wells played any part in the squirrel's death, other than voicing her frustrations or fear of having to take care of a wild animal. When John Ridgely promised his daughter Eliza that he would, quote, that Eliza would receive, quote, a good whipping for killing the squirrel, Diddy does not mention any more about the enslaved girl or the pet squirrel in her diaries. This could mean that either no physical punishment was given or that it did not warrant a mention from Eliza. For slaveholders, uncertainty was power. It created fear, tension, and compliance, a reward system designed to condition behavior. To outsiders, the giving of Christmas gifts by the Risleys to the enslaved children of Hampton looked like generosity. To those children, it was a reminder you're being watched. Your behavior is judged, and your rewards or punishment are arbitrary. This is soft power at work. But power, even soft power, never went unchallenged. The types of resistance employed by the enslaved peoples were as varied as those used to them. John Hope Franklin and Lawrence Swersinger describes the different types of resistance that could be found utilized on many southern plantations in the following way. Quote, "Most of what historians have termed day-to-day resistance involved crimes against property. Slaves pulled down fences, sabotaged farm equipment, broke implements, damaged boots, vandalized wagons, ruined clothing, and committed various other destructive acts. Some blacks worked slowly or indifferently, took unscheduled respites, performed careless or sloppy labor when planting, hoeing, or harvesting crops. Other slaves turned to whiskey or other ardent spirits, an expression of as an expression of their frustration," unquote. Resistance allowed enslaved people to gain and maintain even small levels of agency in a system that sought to remove it. Sometimes acts of resistance by the enslaved could cause acts of control by slaveholders. One example of this was when an enslaved person tried their hand at self-liberation. When John Hawkins fled Hampton sometime in the 1840s, John Ridgely would turn to the courts to help aid the return of his laborer. The laws acted as a means of control for slaveholders like John Risley. Legal protection provided slaveholders the institution of slavery almost complete control over how they dealt with their enslaved workers. However, prior to 1850, slaveholders could find it hard to exercise that power and control north of the Mason-Dixon. Over the course of the first half of the 19th century, a complex infrastructure was built to facilitate the return of runaway slaves. With the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, slaveholders were able to tap into the legal protection of slavery in all corners of the United States. Absconding was one of the most visible ways an enslaved person could practice resistance. The death of an owner, fear of sale, or other events in which a slave could find themselves being forcibly removed from their neighborhood could lead to an enslaved person running away. In August of 1852, an advertisement was placed in the Baltimore Sun for the return of Rebecca Posey, an enslaved woman from Hampton. The ad described Posey as a light-colored Negro girl who called herself Rebecca Posey, about 5 foot or 1 or 2 inches high, 15 years old, with a round-looking face. As can be inferred by the language of the ad, no woman named Rebecca Posey existed in any of Hampton's records. However, there were enslaved women with the name Rebecca who were alive at Hampton in the early 1850s. But one of them was likely a child born circa 1852. The other was a woman who was referred to in the Negro clothing list as Rachel's Rebecca. This Rebecca was born around 1837 and would have been about 15 years old when the ad ran. There were also several enslaved people at Hampton with the last name Posey or Posse. It is likely that Rachel's Rebecca was Rebecca Posey from the ad, and that she either gave herself the surname Posey or married one of the enslaved men with a surname, such as Mark Posey. Not every enslaved person who ran away was looking to self-emancipate. Many cases of absconding were temporary and meant as a practice of agency and testing of the boundaries of white control. One leading cause for absconding was proximity to freedom, or places with large free black populations where an escaped enslaved person could hope to blend in with a larger population. Though Hampton sat between the free state of Pennsylvania and the runaway hotspot of Baltimore City, documentary evidence reveals that the plantation saw relatively few acts of absconding. Sometimes, some today still say that Grizzlies were kind enslavers because they didn't sell many people away. However, through a detailed examination of the archives, that assertion has become complicated. Augustus Gibbs first appeared in Hampton's records around 1841. He appears both on the clothing list and in the Christmas list, where he received a harmonica that year. In 1842, he was put out of the house for bad behavior, and all records of him stopped. Put out of the house may thus be a euphemism for being sold away. It is not unheard of for a young child to find themselves in the slave trade, either as part of a family unit or being sold by themselves. In fact, enslaved children made up a large component of the slave trade. A 15-year-old enslaved boy was advertised in the Fredericktown Herald in September 1832. While the ad highlights the fact that the boy was a slave for life, it also stipulated that he was not to be sold out of the state. The notion of slaveholders making the protection of the black family a primary concern, and that buying and selling of enslaved workers was a convenient fiction told by planters to make themselves feel better about the buying and selling of people. Also, it worked to make slaves more compliant as they sought to protect the integrity of their families, not by angering their masters and being sold away to someone less caring. Though there's no evidence to state whether Ridgely sold Augustus away, if he did, that cell would have sent a message to the rest of the enslaved on the plantation. The threat of sale was a powerful coercive tool that was at the disposal of the slaveholding class, while the ambiguity around the fate of young Augustus Gibbs allows Hampton to maintain a narrative that the Ridgeleys did not break up families through the domestic slave market. It's a narrative that is proving far more complex than the popular history of the site suggests. But let's be clear, they still bought people. They still separated kin groups, and the absence of mass sale wasn't mercy, it was strategy. Maintaining a stable enslaved community made things run more smoothly. It reduced rebellion. It also helped Ridgely's preserve their public image, refined aristocratic benevolence. But what we see now is that their vision of benevolence was really just another mask for control. The domestic slave trade was one of the cruelest mechanisms for control. The reason why speculation in the slave trade was an effective means of control lay mainly in what the trade meant for the enslaved. The effect of the slave trade on the enslaved was vast and varied as the types of people who were bought and sold in it. The enslaved who found themselves caught up in the trade were often separated from the only world they had known and confronted with the brutality of the slave trade as they were marched to the southern slave markets, where they would be confronted with two potential deaths, one physical and another social. As historian Walter Johnson explains, the enslaved would face a social death as they, quote, turn away from their histories and were torn away from their histories and identities, unquote, while the physical death was due to the killing fields of the lower South sugar and rice plantations. The social death that took place in the slave markets can be seen in the destruction of the enslaved family unit. While slaveholders liked to believe in the paternalistic notion that they had the best interests of their slave laborers at heart, the slave markets brought the reality of their convictions to bear. Slaveholders upheld this notion that they sought to protect the integrity of the slave family by placing the onus of the destruction of the slave family that was brought on by the slave markets onto the slave trader. Thus, the idea of the slave traders breaking up enslaved families was used to maintain the impression of the slaveholders' paternalism. The scapegoat that slave traders provided for the slaveholding class was due in large part to the concept that the family integrity of the enslaved family did not often supersede the financial needs of the slaveholder. The slave market was a factory in the destruction of the slave family. Advertisements placed in newspapers for selling of enslaved peoples highlighted the frequency with which this destruction took place. In an 1842 ad which ran in the Baltimore Sun, a local slaveholder advertised the sale of 4 enslaved boys, quote, for sale, 4 Negro boys, 3 boys slave for life. The ad does not mention what, if any, family the boys may have had. To the market, these boys were not sons, brothers, or members of a more extensive kin network, but a commodity to be bought and sold like any other commodity, whether they were orphans or were forcibly separated from their families. These boys were being removed from the only kin they knew. The social death within the slave trade was felt both by those sold away as well as those left behind. Josiah Henson described in detail how the feeling of loss that was brought on by those scenes of separation stayed with the enslaved people throughout their lives. In his 1849 memoir, Hanson wrote that his master, quote, sent out an agent to sell all his slaves, but me and my family. And now another of those heart-rending scenes was to be witnessed, which had impressed itself so deeply on my childish soul. Husbands and wives, parents and children were to be separated forever. Affections which ran as strong in the Africans as in the Europeans were to be cruelly disregarded, and the iron selflessness generated by the hateful institution was to be exhibited in the most odious and naked deformity, unquote. As Henson revealed, slaveholders were all too ready to disregard the familial affections of the enslaved when that conflicted with the bottom line. Of course, soft power wasn't the only tool in the arsenal of slaveholders. Let's talk about Joe, a boy of 12 or 15, beaten and burned on a Hampton plantation in the winter of 1857. The overseers blamed an enslaved man, Nathan, but John Risley suspected something more. He questioned his overseers and physicians. When word of the child's death reached the larger community, John launched an investigation, not as he wrote out of grief, but because he feared what Joe's death might do to the morale of the workforce. He worried the incident might compromise his position as a paternal figure in the life of the enslaved by causing them to lose faith in his ability to protect them. In the end, it was determined that Joe died of unknown causes. No one was punished, and plantation life moved on. I'm sorry. This moment is revealing even when the system turned diddly. Their priority was control, not justice. Even white children learned to exercise control. Control did not only come from adults. White children at Hampton were being groomed to become enslavers themselves. In 1842, Eliza Diddley Ridgely wrote in her diary about a cherry-picking trip where enslaved Black children did the labor and were only allowed fruit after the white children had taken their share. When two children broke this rule, Diddy cut their rations as punishment. This might seem petty, but it's actually a powerful moment. Diddy was practicing domination and control. Control was a learned behavior. The enslaved children were being reminded of their place. This wasn't a game. It was a lesson in hierarchy, one that both sides learned very young. Some acts of resistance were strategic. Tangible gifts were not the only form of rewards given to enslaved peoples. Often, gifts took the form of certain privileges being bestowed upon them by the slaveholders. In many cases, these privileges were added freedom, such as the ability to travel to neighboring plantations or other destinations away from their plantation. Another example would be wedding ceremonies. The ability to marry for the enslaved peoples receiving the slaveholders' permission to marry added a level of protection and recognition to an institution that had no legal recognition or protection. Anne Williams, a favorite enslaved woman of the Ridgely family, was bestowed such a privilege when the Ridgely family allowed her to wed her free husband in the Great Hall of Hampton. According to James McHoward, according to James McHenry Howard Jr., half-brother to John Ridgely's daughter-in-law, quote, Anne Williams was born and lived and died upon Hampton Place and came from the best strain of servants that had ever been on the place. It was only a few years before the war that she was married in the halls at Hampton to Jack Williams, a mulatto who had been my brother Charles R. Howard's boy and had become free, unquote. Euro-American marriage rituals, such as jumping the broom, reading from the Bible, and reciting a marriage vows, influence the wedding practices of enslaved peoples. These were all ways to lend legitimacy to a non-legally binding union. If enslaved marriages mimicked white unions, whites would see them as more authentic. As an interstatus marriage, Anne Williams and her betrothed Jack in many ways needed the blessing of the family more than if she was to marry an enslaved man from Hampton. The couple, however, was working from a disadvantage, as the Ridgeleys already had less than positive opinions of Jack. Howard described Jack as, quote, a good deal of a rascal, and when he married Anne, he showed a good deal of diplomatic skill in getting permission from Uncle John Ridgely to marry one of his slaves. When Uncle John said to him, Jack, why do you, a free man, want to marry a slave woman? Are you not aware that her children will be my slaves? Unquote. Tierra Hunter describes what she refers to as the economy of scarcity as, quote, two distinct and opposing individuals battle for mastery within an entity that has room enough for only one arbiter, that one always being male, unquote. In a slave marriage, that person was neither the husband nor the wife, but the master. John Ridgely was exercising his command of the economy of scarcity when he approached Jack Williams with the question of why a free man would want to marry an enslaved woman. The answer Williams gave probably surprised John Ridgely. According to Howard, when confronted by John with the question, Jack simply, quote, hummed and ha-haed and finally owned up that he would prefer to marry a slave woman because he would not be bound by law to support her or her children. A few years after Anne became invalid, Jack left her, unquote. If this account is completely accurate, Jack Williams is well versed in his lack of legal rights over his wife and future children, and telling John Ridgely that part of the appeal in marrying an enslaved woman was a lack of the financial burden that came with a nuclear family. Jack was attempting to make enslavement work for him by allowing that financial burden to remain where it legally rested under the institution of slavery, the slaveholder. If Hunter is correct in her assertion that the sexual economy of slavery, denying the legal recognition to marriage, was absolutely essential to making slavery heritable, then both Jack Williams and John Ridgely were well aware of the lack of foundation for enslaved marriages. Both Williams and Ridgely hoped to position themselves to benefit from the sexual economy of slavery. John Ridgely and his wife used gifts, clothing, money, and privilege to ensure loyalty and obedience. Weddings in the Great Hall, funerals, even better slave quarters, each was a token that came with expectations. Returning to Eliza Wells, whether or not she killed that squirrel, her punishment was symbolic. Even minor acts of resistance were met with public rebuke, demonstrating that no child was free from control. At Hampton, the struggle between power and resistance was constant. The Ridgeleys used architecture, rewards, and rituals to exert soft power. The enslaved fought back with every tool they had: cunning, culture, kinship, escape. This isn't just a story about slavery, it's a story about power, how it works, how it hides, and how it is resisted. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Michael. This is a good moment to remind everybody of the Q&A function. It's in the bottom of your screen. And Chloe just placed an invitation for all of you to think of a question that you'd like Michael to answer after this heavy and poignant conversation. So please let us know what you want to hear, and we can definitely get to it. I see one question that just popped out. Were any of the slaves rented out? So hiring out was a common practice during this period. What have you learned about it at Hampton?
So I haven't found any records of John Ridgely hiring out his slaves. Previous owners, I know Captain Charles Ridgely did that, and Governor Charles Ridgely most likely did that, but I haven't found any evidence that John Ridgely did.
All right, thank you. Our friend Gregory Weinman says, hello, Michael. Great talk. Hi, Gregory. It's great to have you here. So the chief curator from Hampton and Fort McHenry is with us in this program, which we really appreciate. There's another question that I'm seeing in the chat. So please use the question and answer because that's easier for us to follow, but I can read it out. What kinds of punishment did you find were used?
So unsurprisingly, most slave holders didn't really record the types of punishment that people
Mm-hmm.
received. So there's not really much documentary evidence of what type of punishment was received. We just know from larger circle records what was most likely to be practiced.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for that. And so listening to you talk and provide what you found, in the evidence about how the enslaved were treated, I can't help but recall some parallel actions actually in other properties or enslaved by other large families in Maryland. I can think of an article that we published in the Maryland Historical Magazine about Charles Carroll of Carrollton and his multiple properties. So controlling marriages, controlling Christmas gifts. Where do you see Hampton in the larger context of similar properties? I know that part of your motivation in writing your dissertation was to kind of put Hampton on the map and to talk more about the Ridgely family. So I was just curious about the larger maybe context of Chesapeake, plantation slavery, even Maryland as a state. What do you think about that?
Yeah, of course. So, it's important when we're thinking about slavery in Maryland to kind of separate it into three distinct groups. We have northern Maryland, which includes Baltimore County, Cecil County, and then you have the Eastern Shore, and then you have Southern Maryland, Montgomery County, Prince George's County, and all three kind of were distinct in how slavery existed there. But the Ridgeleys weren't unique in their dealing with enslaved people. Um, in many cases, they were better than some. In some cases, they were worse. When the iron foundry was up and running at its height, there were lots of examples of brutality and mutilation that occurred to the enslaved people that worked there. When they transitioned away from the iron industry and was just a agricultural plantation, the um, slaves were probably treated roughly the same as they were on most Maryland plantations. Again, being so close to Pennsylvania and Baltimore City, they really had to reduce absconding, and the best way to do that was to be quote unquote kinder, gentler slave masters.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. We have all kinds of questions coming up now, which is wonderful. Thank you so much for submitting them, everybody. Did any of Hampton's enslaved escape with the help of the Underground Railroad?
Again, there's no way for us to know. There's no records in the Ridgeleys that state that.
Mm-hmm.
Most enslaved people didn't read or write. So when they left, when they absconded, they didn't leave records about how they left, even when they
Right.
after.
And the point of the Underground Railroad was to keep it sacred, right? So there's not a lot of record to begin with. Speaking of what you just mentioned, reading and writing, did you find any evidence of literacy among the enslaved?
So in Maryland, reading and writing was not illegal to teach enslaved people. It was frowned upon. Eliza originally held
Mm-hmm.
um, religious services for the enslaved people, but I haven't seen any record that they could read or write. As a whole, there's no evidence that they were being taught to read or write, but there was also no evidence that they were being denied access to that education either.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. What about general emancipation and what that meant for people enslaved at Hampton? Did very many of the slaves or the formerly enslaved stay at the property?
So a lot of them stayed after general emancipation in 1864 and worked the property. I don't have off the top of my head have a running number, but a good portion of them stayed on and worked and then eventually would leave and go to Pennsylvania, go to Baltimore City. But after the war, for the couple decades, a couple of them, including Ann Williams, who I mentioned, stayed on with the family.
Mm-hmm. So moving away from the community for a question. Oh, what they keep coming up. What types of crops were grown on this property, both subsistence and commercial?
So both grain was their primary crop for both subsistence and commercial. Governor Ridgely kind of oversaw the transition to grain at Hampton, and they kept growing grain um, up through the end of slavery. They also raised livestock, cattle. They were big into horse breeding as other ways to supplement their income, but grain was their primary crop.
Mm-hmm. Just trying to make sure that I don't skip anything. Are you tired by now? This is a lot of questions. How are you doing?
Good.
Good. Another example from Gregory is the resistance of elderly Nick Toogood. She says that the Howard memoir mentions the incident. Are you familiar with this? Is there something you would like to share about this,
Um,
or is this note enough?
I'm not overly familiar, not enough to
Okay.
share.
Okay, then that's a great point for everybody else in the audience too. There's a question again about runaway attempts, which I feel we've already addressed. So maybe we'll skip that one. You said there's not a lot of record about it. What about the domestic slave market or people being sold down south? You mentioned some of the differences between regions of enslavement and what that would have meant for somebody to move from one region to another.
Yeah, so I mean, I could talk more about the domestic slave market. There's primarily two domestic slave markets. There was the internal state slave market, and then the one that what Ira Berlin called, the second Middle Passage, where slaves were sold from the north to the south. Um, John Ridgely mostly acquired his enslaved people from the internal Maryland slave market. Um, so these people wouldn't leave the state. When a lot of Maryland slaveholders turned to term enslavement, some of the conditions they placed on the term enslavement was that the enslaved could not be sold out of the state. So there was a big and robust internal slave market. Unfortunately, the scholarship around these internal slave markets hasn't really, it's not robust. It's coming
Mhm.
into fruition, so there's not really a lot written about how these internal slave markets in states like Maryland existed and functioned.
Mhm. Thank you. We have another question about something that comes up every now and then, and that is there any new information about the possible location of the enslaved cemetery at Hampton. It has never been found. I know that my last visit there, I think what's usually spoken about is one formerly enslaved person, and that's the only grave whose location is known. Has anything changed in that regard?
I'm not that I'm aware of. That would be
Right?
a question.
Yeah. Um, all right, moving on. And thank you for asking all these questions. We do have some time left, so I hope that we can get through them. Another question is, what kinds of activities did the Ridgeleys allow the enslaved to do at Christmas besides having the children come to the main house to receive gifts? Any other quote unquote benevolent behavior on their behalf?
So traditionally, enslaved peoples during between Christmas and New Year were given the season off. Um, and they would, they would have parties, go to dances, um, engage with the larger Black community that surrounded the plantations. They would fish, they would try to supplement their daily diet in any way they could. And while there's no evidence exactly of what the enslaved at Hampton did, I would assume, it was fairly similar to what many enslaved people did at that time, which was dance, consume spirits, do other types of activities, visit families and friends that were on other plantations if they could get passes and things such as that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you again. We have another comment that pertains to literacy. So it's just a comment, it's not a question for you. It says, Henry White said the kids would ask him when he was about 10 to teach them to read, but it was discouraged. So just a little bit more context for that question and that theme. I believe we have two questions related to religion. One of them asks is if you have any perspective of why Eliza offered religious services.
Other than the fact that Eliza and her sister were very devout Methodists, and they made it their mission to proselytize to the enslaved people of their faith. That's really the only reason, just her Methodist faith. She just wanted the enslaved people to also be
Mm-hmm.
practicing that religion as she felt it was, the true denomination.
Right, and we have a follow-up question, which maybe you've just answered now, which is there any evidence of religious practice at Hampton actually being used to influence or guide behavior? So also being an instrument of control among the enslaved community. Would you say that?
And Henry Bannon Chu, who married one of Governor Ridgely's daughter, actually constructed Epsom Church in Towson, which was a church used by Blacks and enslaved people of the area. So that's another example of the family using religion.
Mm-hmm. The next question is more about terminology, which can sometimes be a really interesting topic, which is one researcher, we don't have the citation, but a researcher apparently has said that Baltimore County during Eliza's period, I'm trying to reconstruct the sentence, would call her estate a farm and not a plantation. So in terms of terminology, which term would you decide upon, and do you have reasons why?
So I use plantation, and I think
Mm-hmm.
plantation because plantation in this context was a place that um, grew a cash crop by enslaved peoples to be sold at market. And that's primarily the function of Hampton at this period.
Mm-hmm. Um, Oh, okay. Sorry. Questions just keep coming up. We have a few more. And actually these are from we have two from one of the same participant tonight. One is when was slavery stopped, which I guess, refers to the 1864 general emancipation, but was there any kind of waning before that date, or did it just continue until that point in time?
So slavery in Maryland really hit its height before the Panic of 1819. That's when Governor Ridgely had the giant 24,000 acre plantation with over 300 enslaved people. But the Panic of 1819 really hit slave holding in Maryland hard as grain prices fell, and these slaveholders with these large, robust enslaved plantations had to try to figure out a way to um, do something with their enslaved peoples while cash was short. So at this time, 1810s, 1820s, you really see a shift away from enslavement for life to term enslavement in a lot of plantations. John
Mm-hmm.
was kind of the exception in keeping a big enslaved for life plantation, but most people during this time were switching to term enslavement to kind of lessen the cost, year-round costs associated with slavery.
Mm-hmm. And then how does that translate into after 1864 and what happened to the property, to the plantation?
So,
Is that part of your research too?
so I stopped at 1864,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
post 1864, Hampton transitions like most plantations into sharecropping and other forms of farming where they enslave people. Other tenants would come and farm the property at the bequest of the owners. They would pay rents and dues to the family. But after 1864, that's really what you see Hampton turn into a place with sharecropping.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So to the point of terminology and again the term plantation, we do have a comment from somebody that says there's an accepted definition that a farm would house under 50 enslaved people and a plantation would be more. Would you say that that's pretty much the scholarship standard?
Sure. Um, sure. I'm not really sure what the set scholarly definition of plantation.
Right. Yeah, just adding to the conversation. Um, So we've already answered one of these questions. What was the cash crop during that period? You talked about grain being both a domestic and cash or commercial crop. There is a question about moving between the quarters that you mentioned. So were families ever returned, for example, to wood quarters for perceived bad behavior after being favored with stone quarters? Like, do you see movement between the tiers, so to speak?
So again, the originalists didn't really keep records of who lived where, what enslaved people lived in which housing, were used for what purposes. So we can only surmise about, the function of these quarters and how and why
Mm-hmm.
certain people were allowed to live in them.
Oh, okay. Questions are jumping. We've answered the one that's next on our list. Let me see if I can decipher this one. Since Governor Ridgely freed enslaved people only over a certain age, and the children supposedly remained enslaved in the area, could we say that the threat of being sold was a form of soft power?
Yeah, yeah. So
Or would that be hard power? I mean, being sold is pretty not soft.
I mean, both. I think hard power more be like selling a slave person south,
Mm-hmm.
really
Mm-hmm.
taking them away from everything they knew. But these term slaves weren't allowed to be sold out of state. Most of them, I haven't found any evidence that any of them ended up on the slave market. But that threat was always there for them. But yeah, that is
Yeah.
an example of soft power.
All right, and I have one final question, and we have had over 20 questions and comments, just so you know. I want to say this is probably one of the most popular public talks that I've hosted at MCHC, so we really appreciate you, Michael. Is it true that after emancipation, some of the enslaved would choose to stay just because, that was a familiar environment and opportunities might have been harsher elsewhere?
Yeah, so I mean, enslaved people, just like people today, their motivations were varied and vast, and some people chose to stay for a variety of reasons. Sure, security was one, but yeah, enslaved people chose to stay at Hampton, for a multitude of reasons after emancipation.
Thank you. This was a great conversation, and I'm really, really glad that we were able to engage with so many of our participants' question today. I would like to summon Chloe back on screen. Michael, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your work of the past many years. So once again, congratulations on defending your dissertation. When we look forward to seeing where you take this, books, talks, whatever's in your future, we're there for it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was an honor.
Thank you. Thank you all. This was wonderful. Truly, to echo Martina, the most involved viewership we've had. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you for the conversation it inspired. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Congratulations, Michael. Many thanks to you, Martina, for keeping us flowing and keeping this program, just keeping it good. Good conversation.
It was so dynamic. Yeah.
So thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. And yeah, we hope to see you all again soon.